Therapy Chat Podcast, episode 334.
This is the Therapy Chat Podcast with Laura Reagan, LCSW-C. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health professional. And now, here's your host, Laura Reagan, LCSW-C.
Today's episode is sponsored by Trauma Therapist Network. Trauma Therapist Network is a platform for finding a trauma therapist, learning about trauma, and understanding about how trauma shows up in our lives and what the healing process can look like. Go to www.traumatherapistnetwork.com to learn more. This week's episode is sponsored by Therapy Notes, the #1 rated electronic health record system available today. With live telephone support 7 days a week, it's clear why Therapy Notes is rated 4.9 out of 5 stars on Trustpilot and has a 5-star rating on Google. Therapy Notes makes billing, scheduling, note-taking, and telehealth incredibly easy. And now, for all you prescribers out there, Therapy Notes is proudly introducing ePrescribe. Use coupon code CHAT or click the link in the show notes to get 2 free months at therapynotes.com. Hi, welcome back to Therapy Chat. I'm your host, Laura Reagan. Did you catch last week's episode, my interview with Terry Real, where he was talking about how patriarchal constructs of masculinity limit men's ability to engage in emotional intimacy and expression? I loved talking with him, and I feel like that's a really, really important conversation because as a therapist, I often work with women. I work with men too. I have many female identifying clients who are married to male identifying people, and the women are often feeling pretty hopeless about their husbands ever being able to connect with them on an emotional level. And it's really sad because I know as a wife and a mother of a son and a therapist who's worked with many male clients, including children, there's not a difference across genders in the emotions that humans feel, but there is a difference across genders in which emotions are socially acceptable and how we are culturally conditioned to behave, which feelings we have to shut down and which feelings we're allowed to express. So I loved talking with Terry because I think he gives hope that this can change, that men can be emotionally expressive and have deep connected relationships. And he talked about his newest book talks about how people can heal their relationships. So hopefully you heard that, but if you didn't, please go back and listen to episode 333 because it was wonderful. And there's a link to it in the show notes for this episode. Today, I'm bringing you a replay of a conversation I had last year with Dr. Ronald Levant and Shana Pryor about toxic masculinity. Ronald and Shana co-wrote The Tough Standard, The Hard Truths About Masculinity and Violence. In the United States, violence is a major problem. We hear news stories about mass shootings, war, and sexual and domestic violence daily, as well as child abuse. Most of us who are listening have probably experienced some form of emotional or physical or sexual violence during our lifetime, unfortunately. It's a common thing in our culture, and it doesn't have to be. And that's why it's really important to talk about these gender norms, for one thing, because what Ronald and Shana talked about in our conversation is how the construct of masculinity in Western culture impinges upon men and others, contributing to violent behavior. Every time we have a mass shooting, which recently has been like twice a day, everyone's saying in the news, why did he do this? Why are the young men so angry? Why are the old men so angry? Why are all the men so angry? And Ron and Shana explain why and what can be done about it, and how that socialization that is not men's fault, it's just what happened by them having that gender assigned to them at birth. But the problems that it can cause are serious and don't have to be like that. We all want to have loving, safe relationships. And no one really wants to be a person who harms other people. So I feel like this is a really important subject. As someone who has worked with survivors of sexual violence for 20 years, I'm very well aware of these dynamics and have been for a long time. But in our culture, it still doesn't seem to be really sinking in the harm that toxic masculinity does. So I hope you will find some encouragement and hope in this conversation about how violence that seems endless can change. And just want to mention real quick that in July, Trauma Therapist Network registration is reopening for trauma therapists to join. And in case you're not really familiar with what it is a directory of trauma therapists, but it is also a community for trauma therapists with me leading the community. And we meet weekly, 4 times a month, and we have calls that are live and then they're recorded. So people show up live, and then if you can't be there live, you can go back and watch the recording. And everyone who joins gets access to all the recordings from the past months. And as long as you're a member, you'll continue to have access to all the new content that's added. So check out the show notes if you're interested in joining Trauma Therapist Network. You might want to go ahead and get on the waiting list so you can be one of the first to know when registration opens in July. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Hi, welcome back to Therapy Chat. I'm your host, Laura Reagan, and today I'm very excited to be bringing you a conversation with the authors of The Tough Standard, The Hard Truths About Masculinity and Violence. My guests today are Dr. Ron Levant and Shana Pryor. Ron and Shana, thank you so much for being my guests on Therapy Chat today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Laura.
You're so welcome. I know we have a lot to talk about, but let's start off by each of you taking a moment to just tell the audience a little bit about who you are and what you do, if you will.
Shana, do you want to go first?
So my name is Shana Pryor. I am currently a doctoral student getting my PhD in counseling psych. I'm getting that from the University of Akron. My main areas are men as victims of interpersonal violence, as well as compassion and self-compassion and shame. I mean, just a little bit of fun things about me. I have a black cat named Nix, and I'm also a gamer.
Thank you.
I'm at the other end of the spectrum. I'm a professor of psychology emeritus at the University of Akron, and I've been a psychologist for over 45 years. And my area of specialty is the psychology of men and masculinities. People regard me as one of the key people who actually created this field within psychology. I was the co-chair of the committee that created a division within APA called the Society for the Psychological Study of Men and Masculinities. And I co-authored the first graduate textbook that called the New Psychology of Men, that was in print for over 20 years. And I've basically been doing research as well as finding new ways to provide psychological services to men for quite some time now.
That's awesome. And as much as, Ron, you have been working and researching in the field of psychology of men for a long time, it still seems so little understood, at least in the mainstream, how, it seems like counseling and therapy tend to be focused on, well, not focused on, but women tend to be the consumers of counseling and therapy so much more often than men. And men seem to have their own unique issues, in my experience, that, are seldom addressed, at least out there in the world. So I'm really glad that we're talking today.
Yeah, I am too. No, I think that's part of the problem, as we'll get into it, is that it's really not men that is the problem, but it's masculinity. And people might be taken aback by making that distinction, but it's an important distinction to make. Men vary a great deal, but all men beginning as boys have been confronted with demand that they conform to the norms of masculinity. Some people think of masculinity as synonymous with being a man, but we psychologists understand masculinity as a set of social norms. And we're all familiar with social norms. They're norms for how close we can stand next to a person, or we're holding a door for someone who's coming after us. But then there are also gender norms. And these are norms that kind of specify the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are expected of people of different genders. And even more importantly, the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are prohibited for people of different genders. So masculinity, we'll probably get into defining it a little bit more, but it has certain requirements that make it difficult for many men to reveal vulnerability, to put their emotions into words, and to engage in the kind of processes that we all understand to be necessary in psychotherapy.
Yes. Shana, do you have anything you want to add to that before I jump back in?
Nope.
Okay. I think that, I often talk on this podcast about patriarchal structures and how they're limiting to people of any gender. Do you feel like that's the same wheelhouse as what you're talking about with the social norms of gender roles and masculinity?
To some extent, masculinity is oppressive to certain groups. It is oppressive to women because one of the central masculinity norms is to avoid all things feminine, which essentially otherizes women. And masculinity really is a set of norms that are designed to keep men in the power forward position and to keep women in the power under position. But it also is oppressive to various groups of men who are not deemed to be kind of the premier type of man. In the United States, the most honored way of being a man is to be a white, cisgendered, heterosexual, Christian man with blue eyes who plays at least 2 sports. I'm kidding about that last part. And so therefore, it marginalizes men of color. And this is a topic I hope we get more into, which is very important today as we're kind of going through this intense Black Lives Matter movement. But it also marginalizes men of different gender identities and sexual orientations than cisgendered heterosexual. But what does it do to the men themselves, even the white Christian, et cetera men? Well, it impinges upon them. It doesn't oppress them. It gives them a great deal of status in our society, which I would describe as kind of a patriarchy that has been softened by 60 years of second wave feminist activism and political activity. But it impinges upon men largely in the way that I mentioned earlier on, that it kind of confronts young boys with a demand that they conform to masculinity norms and makes these boys feel as if masculinity is obligatory. And, this comes up in the family. This comes up also when children go to preschool and elementary school, and peers police the gender norms fiercely. And talk to any boy, okay, or any man who was a boy. And I, as a man who was a boy, I can tell you, yes, that certainly happened in my childhood. And boys who deviated from conformity to the masculinity norms got teased or worse. They often got beaten up. So that's kind of how I see how patriarchy affects different groups in our society. It oppresses women, men of color, and sexual and gender identity minority men, and it impinges on all men.
Yeah. And I think I would definitely agree with that. And, when we talk a little bit about patriarchy, I want to say that it is absolutely oppressive to women. And it also puts men themselves back. As, when we think about patriarchy and men's need to be the ones on top, masculinity really inhibits their ability to kind of relate to other people and form these relationships that can make them feel more fulfilled.
And let me just jump in on that one. It's one of the ways that my research has focused on the masculinity norm to restrict the expression of vulnerable and attachment or caring emotions. And, this kind of backing up, I noticed this a long time ago, back in the 1980s, when I had started this project at Boston University called the BU Fatherhood Project, which was a research and service activity in which we offered courses, non-credit courses, to men in the community. These weren't patients or clients. These were just men who were fathers and wanted to, know more about parenting. And this occurred at a time like 83 is when we started the project, when the involved father was just coming on the scene. In Harvard Square, you could see men with infants in snuggly packs or pushing strollers. And people are just starting to pay attention to some changes in the father's role, that they were actually providing care to children as opposed to the former kind of distant good provider, chief disciplinarian role. And during this project, which ran for 5 years, we had a bunch of different classes for fathers, for single fathers, stepfathers, fathers who worked and their wives worked. The central course was called the Fatherhood course. And basically, it offered parent education to dads. And that was really needed because a couple of years earlier, I'd done a literature review on parent education or parent training and found that none of the review articles that existed then even mentioned whether the parent group included fathers. It was just assumed that this is for mothers. So there was nothing for fathers who at that time were just starting to, take a more hands-on role of being an involved parent. And so we would meet a class of 8 or 10 men, meet once a week for a couple hours in the evening for 10 weeks. And back then, video equipment was very cool, and I had gotten a grant, and I bought an enormous amount of video equipment, which impressed the men when they came in. They saw all this high-tech equipment, and it was how we did business back then. We told the men, we're going to help you become a better father by same way you might have learned a sport like tennis or golf. We're going to do it. We're going to tape it. We're going to watch the tape and break it down and figure out how to do it better. So in this class, a man had come in, was kind of visibly upset. And I asked what was wrong. And he said his son had stood him up for a father-son hockey game. So back then I was pretty naive about men and emotion. So I asked him, well, how did you feel about that? Being a good psychologist, one of the first things you ask. And he turned to me and with his finger pointed and a very vigorous gesture saying, he shouldn't have done it. So I said, okay, well, why don't we role play this? You play yourself, Tim, and Don, you play his ex-wife as she delivers the news to him that his son had forgotten about it and gone on and done something else. We do the video, the role play, the video, we play it back. I point out to him, I said, look in the monitor. Look at yourself in the monitors. His shoulders had fallen into a slump. His face was in a frown. I said, what were you feeling? So he, with his hand on his chin, thinking very hard, he said, I guess I must have been disappointed. I thought to myself, I guess I must have been disappointed with all this coaching. Mm-hmm. What might a mother have said in an analogous situation like her daughter standing her up for a shopping date? Well, at first I was surprised because it's not like her to act that way. I was hurt that she acted with so little regard for my feelings. And then I was worried that maybe she's upset with me and this is her way of showing it. And then I was disappointed and annoyed because I built my whole day around the date and now it was ruined. I guess I was disappointed, surprised, hurt, worried, disappointed, and annoyed. What's going on here? So my colleagues at the time were not very supportive. They thought I was nuts. They said, forget it, Ron. I mean, that's just the way men are. Mm-hmm. Now, in my doctoral program at Harvard, I had trained as a child clinical psychologist, did an internship at the Child Guidance Center. And so part of my, the educational components, I became familiar with developmental psych, the developmental psych literature. And I was aware that there was a section in that literature called emotion socialization, which studied how children were differentially socialized to express certain emotions based on their gender. And going into that literature, there's about 40 or 50 studies that I reviewed at the time. I found out some very interesting things about men's emotion socialization or boys' emotional socialization. And again, this is under the masculinity norm of restrict the expression of vulnerable and caring emotions. So children are being socialized to conform to these norms. So what do we find when we look at this literature? There are a large number of studies of neonates hours after birth, okay? And what do neonates do? They sleep or they cry. But observational studies of neonates neonates indicated, and I think there were even 18 studies of neonates, that boys were considered more emotionally expressive than girls at that stage, which meant that they probably cried more and changed more rapidly between emotional states. So boys start off more emotionally expressive than girls, which is really interesting. And they maintain this advantage until about 1 year of age. Then at 1 year of age, obviously, they do a lot more than cry and sleep. They gurgle and coo, and they express they express a wider range of emotions. But you start to see a study at 2 years of age, boys and girls, showed that girls were starting to leap ahead. They were more verbally expressive of emotions than boys. And then between the ages of 4 and 6, you find that boys become less facially expressive of emotions. And I kind of have to tell you about this study because I think it's one of the coolest studies I've ever come across. The investigator, Ross Buck of the University of Connecticut, recruited mothers of 4 to 6-year-old children. And these were boys and girls. And child was shown an emotionally stimulating slide. And the mother was in an adjacent room watching her child's face on a video monitor. And the dependent variable in the study was, could she accurately identify the slide shown to her child? So the results were that at 4 years of age, mothers of boys and mothers of girls were equally accurate. But as the children aged, the mothers of sons grew less and less accurate, so that by the age of 6, the mothers of boys were, significantly less accurate than the mothers of girls. So what's going on with boys between the ages of 4 and 6? They're going to preschool and school, being socialized by their peers. As I mentioned earlier, the peers serve as, gender police. And so Buck was able to document that during this time period where the major life experience of boys, has suddenly changed, that they are less facially expressive of emotions. Now, based on these studies and also research I did in measuring masculinity norms, I put forward the normative male alexithymia hypothesis. Now, I know your listeners are probably not going to know what that word means, so I'll define it. Alexithymia is a clinical term that means literally without words for emotions. And my hypothesis was that boys who were socialized under the masculinity norm to restrict the expression of vulnerable and caring emotions grew up to be adult men who literally had trouble putting their emotions into words. They had a mild form of alexithymia, which could take one of several forms. But maybe I should stop there and let you ask another question.
Okay, sure. I'm totally interested in everything you're saying. And first, let me say, when you mentioned the study, Ross Buck's study, I know that oftentimes when people I interview mention studies, I get emails later saying, what's the citation for that study? So I'd love if you could shoot that to me at some point, and I could just include it with the show notes so people can look it up if you have it.
Okay, let me make a note of that.
Thanks. And so everything you've been saying has been really interesting, but we're getting into talking about alexithymia, and I really am glad you brought that up. I know I want to go back to talking about the norms and even that definition of masculinity a little more deeply, but I have several comments. One is, as a therapist, I work with probably about a third of my clients are men and 2/3 women. And men will often tell me, my wife says she wants me to be more sensitive, but I actually don't think that she would like me if I didn't act tough, for lack of, they don't necessarily say act tough, but it's like, if I allow myself to be softer, she won't be attracted to that. And then I hear from women.
And they base this on?
Well, I'm assuming it's the internalized beliefs about masculinity, but also women's, a lot of women do have a certain expectation of men to be a certain way. And that, that's where I hear from my female clients. Oftentimes they say, men don't really have feelings. Oh, my husband, he doesn't have feelings. He just doesn't feel anything. That's how men are. And I'm like, no, that's not true. So I just think it's kind of interesting the way our society talks about what's normal for men and women, and there's what we want and then what we expect.
Well, you bring up a very interesting point, which is the complicity of everyone in maintaining these gender arrangements. And it is true. I have seen, evidence that some women, kind of expect their man to conform to masculinity norms, and, others do not. But I think as a society, these gender roles are so ingrained that it's hard to find a clear path to exist outside of them.
Mm-hmm.
How many people reinforce those norms for us? I can well understand, the comments you made. Let me talk about a man in therapy who was alexithymic. Because I started working, with this construct of normative male alexithymia around 89. And I had left faculty position at Rutgers and essentially returned to Boston and became a part-time faculty member at Harvard Medical School at Cambridge Hospital. And I had maintained a practice while I was down in New Jersey because I commuted back and forth and was home on the weekends and would see patients on Saturday. So I expanded my practice into full-time. And I told my colleagues, particularly my female colleagues at Cambridge Hospital, that I was opening up full-time practice, and would they please send me the men that their women clients complained about. And I called my practice Counseling for Men, and it was filled with men who had a lot of relationship problems. And I would say that most of the men in my practice were sent. They didn't wake up one morning and say, I've been thinking about this. I've got normative male alexithymia. I think I'll call Dr. Ronald Levant. No. They were told, you either, you call this Dr. Levant or else. And some of them were sent by their wives or female partners, and some were sent by other members of the family, and some were sent by their supervisors or employers. So I had a practice of these men, and I was, really wanting to work clinically with alexithymia and see what could happen. I developed what ultimately became a manualized treatment called Alexithymia Reduction Treatment, ART for short. But at the time I was experimenting and doing different things. As it exists now, it's kind of a CBT-like stepwise program. But let me tell you about this client. He was sent because his wife of 15 years was concerned that he didn't feel anything about the fact that she was pregnant, they were going to have a baby. Now, I'm sure among your listeners, anybody who's a parent knows that being a parent, becoming a parent, is one of life's most dramatic experiences. It absolutely changes your life from the moment you are not a parent to the moment you are a parent. And it is, in my view, life's hardest job, and for which adults receive the least amount of preparation. So it was odd that he had no feelings. I mean, I can think of like excitement. I can think of fear, all kinds of things that should be happening. But he didn't think it was odd because normally he didn't really have any feelings. He didn't have any feelings. So I asked him when was the last time he actually cried. And he said it was 10 years ago when his dog got hit by a car and died. 10 years. Mm-hmm. The way I work with this man is I started off by helping him develop a list of vocabulary for emotions, so that he could at least name emotions, and, so that he had a range of words that he could use to describe emotions that he felt or other people felt. And, I met with him over about 4 or 5 months, but we only met 12 times because of his travel schedule. So we began, working with the vocabulary. And then I asked him to start observing other people when he was talking to them. And I taught him a little bit about nonverbal communication and nonverbal expression of emotions, facial expression, tone of voice, paralinguistics like sighs and cries and gasps, and body language. And I said, just observe people and ask yourself the question, what is she feeling when she's saying this? And then try to go through your vocabulary list that you've now developed and pick out the word or words that describe the emotion. So I'm teaching him to identify emotions in other people, which I found is a necessary step to identifying emotions in oneself, especially for an alexithymic man. Back then, I would identify alexithymia through an interview. I subsequently developed a scale called the Normative Male Alexithymia Scale, which has gone through another revision recently. But once I've identified that they meet criteria for alexithymia, I could have also used the Toronto Alexithymia Scale 20. And then I explain what we're going to do, get buy-in for the method, and start working. And I think this particular approach has homework and is kind of very results-oriented. And I found it was pretty congruent with the way that men like to work in therapy. It wasn't kind of non-directive or free associated. It was kind of more action-oriented. So the third step involves identifying emotions in yourself. And I ask my clients to keep, some 3x5 index cards handy. And whenever they thought they had an emotion, and many of my clients wouldn't actually be able to know they actually had an emotion, but they would experience some change in their body, like butterflies in my stomach or a tight band across my forehead. That's how they describe it. And I said, whenever you have this sensation in your body or a feeling, if you actually know that it is a feeling, write it down, the time, what the feeling or sensation is, and then ask yourself the question, who is doing what to whom, and how does that affect me? And then, once you've identified that, go through your vocabulary list and find a word or words that express the emotion that you're feeling. So this particular client, when we did this exercise, had used his emotional response log in response to kind of a mildly traumatic event at work where, his mechanic had not had his car ready, and so he missed a crop report. He was kind of a commodities trader, advisor, and wasn't able to help his clients, make whatever investment they were looking at. And so it was from his point of view, a major bad day. And so we worked with the emotional response log. And of course, the first emotion that he came up with was he was angry at the mechanics. And I explained to him that because we as boys learn to transform our vulnerable feelings like sadness or hurt into anger, that probably there were other emotions underneath there, and to dig a little deeper. And so he did. And, the emotions he came up with were that he was disappointed, felt let down by his mechanic. He felt a sense of failure, guilt that he had failed his clients, and fear that he would lose these clients. So, working with him in this way, he's getting down to kind of the kinds of emotions we clinicians like to talk about. And, I worked with him, as I said, to help him develop an ability to identify and describe his emotions. We then started talking about his family of origin. And, initially when I took the history, he talked about his father in very kind of superficial terms: good man, hardworking man, an Air Force hero in World War II. His father was a bombardier. Do you know what that is?
I think I know. It's the person who directs where the bombs are going to be dropped.
No.
Okay.
Most people don't know. So don't feel bad. So the bombers, these big, bombers would have a little bubble beneath the tail. And in that bubble would sit a man with a machine gun. And that man would kind of shoot down the fighter jets that were trying to drop the bomber. So it's a very exposed position, like 1 second from death, and quite heroic in my estimation. And his father, kind of many, many years after the war, was still living in the war. He belonged to all these veterans organizations. He, collected World War II memorabilia and the like. And his vocation was, they lived in a small city, I think, in the Midwest. And his father was the publisher of that town's or city's local newspaper. So my client, wanting to connect with his dad, who he worshiped, became the editor of his high school paper, so that they could talk about the duties of the press and the freedom of the press, and kind of connect. He wanted to connect with his dad, but his dad wasn't having any of it. He was too busy and all of that. And so later on, he's out of the house. He's finished college. He's in the Army. His father, he gets word his father had a heart attack. Could he come home? And so his response was to say, F you. I don't have to do that. We men don't care. We don't have to do that. It was like this, angry response. And that was really the first emotion that I had seen him express toward his father, was anger. I did another exercise where I had him write down the questions that he would ask his father if he were alive today, explaining that, of course, he's not alive and he can't answer them, and he probably couldn't answer them when he was alive, visiting his mother. And so he was at the gravesite, and I had him take his cards with him and stand by the gravesite and read the cards. And that was a very tearful, sorrowful experience for him. And so underneath all that anger that he experienced for his father was a lot of grief, because essentially he was grieving for the relationship he wanted to have with his dad, but never could. We continued to work a little bit after that, and then we terminated. And about a little while after we terminated, I got a postcard from him saying, it's a boy, all the stats, how 6 pounds, 9 ounces, blah, 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 blah. And then he added, I should say, one of my client's interests was participating in Scottish rituals, with the bagpipes and the kilts and all that. Mm-hmm. Wrote at the bottom of the note, and he even looked Scottish. That's kind of my story of how I at least helped one man reclaim his emotional life and what a difference it made in his life.
Running a group private practice has been a challenging and rewarding experience, and one thing that has made it so much easier is Therapy Notes. Therapy Notes makes billing, scheduling, note-taking, and telehealth incredibly easy. If you're coming from another EHR, like I did, Therapy Notes makes the transition incredibly easy, importing your demographic data free of charge so you can get going right away. My team has found Therapy Notes very easy to learn. It's intuitive. The customer support is second to none. And that's one of the things that has kept me a Therapy Notes customer for several years now. Anytime I've needed to contact Therapy Notes for help with an issue I couldn't figure out on my own, I've been able to get through to someone and resolve the issue within 15 minutes, 99% of the time. Find out what more than 100,000 mental health professionals already know. Try Therapy Notes for 2 months absolutely free. Just click on the link in the show notes or enter the promo code CHAT at therapynotes.com. Yeah, so before I say anything, I just want to see if Shana wants to add anything to what's been said so far.
Oh, well, I actually had a response to your original question as well, but I think I'm actually going to probably respond to what Ron was saying, is because I was thinking about the bombardier and the lack of emotions and what I think that means to some men. And that, when you're in these kinds of positions, I've had a lot of men, my own male clients, I think that say, hey, if I start showing emotions, what's going to happen? Like, if I open up that door, what's going to happen to me? How am I going to be able to handle all of these situations when I have to be the caregiver or I have to be the provider? And I think that relates a little bit, Laura, to what you were saying in the beginning, where, well, if I'm not tough, then is she going to, is my wife or significant other going to love me? And I think that speaks to the unknown that I think a lot of men feel when they try to challenge some of these masculine norms. And really, I want to say that, we never really teach people that, emotions are, I think in a situation like the bombardier, or, if you're a firefighter, or, you're in the military, in those situations, it's normal to kind of not have emotions because you have to survive. But the difference is that at some point you have to come out of that. You can't live there. And I think that that's where a lot of men tend to think, well, this worked for me in this environment, so it could work for me everywhere else. So I don't really have to feel emotions. In reality, they do.
Yeah, I think one of the things is that not only do they feel them, but whether they try not to show them, anyone who tries to hold their feelings in, they're still there under the surface and they're affecting us, whether it's making it difficult for us to be close within our relationships, or just this sense of something's missing, or also things we avoid doing, things we avoid dealing with because we just don't know what to do. All of that goes on below the surface, whether we're really aware of it or not. So we think we're like holding our emotions in successfully and just being an unemotional person, but there's a toll that it takes, I think, on the individual who's suppressing their feelings. And that can be both, emotional, as I just mentioned, but also physical. And then in addition, the way their relationships are.
Mm-hmm. And I'm also thinking that, as a woman, because I was also thinking about your female clients that, I'm trying to remember exactly how you said it, that might be attracted to men who are less sensitive.
Yeah.
I think that masculine norms and myths isn't just something men need to learn. I think it's something women need to learn as well. Because I think one of the worst things that you can do, as a partner to a man is to say, man up and, be a man. And, especially when they try to be sensitive. I've had a lot of people who attempt to be sensitive, and it really gets thrown back at them, and it just sends them back 3 steps. So I want to say this as a woman. I think women also need to kind of consider their role in this as well.
One thing I wanted to kind of, since, we're kind of here because of the book, which is called The Tough Standard, The Hard Truths About Masculinity and Violence, I wanted to kind of draw attention to the relationship between alexithymia and violence. And I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about depression. I think both of you are aware that men are diagnosed with major depressive disorder, which is considered the common cold of mental illness, not because of its lack of severity, but because of its frequency. That men are diagnosed half as frequently as women with major depressive disorder. And that can't be biological. And a number of my colleagues have kind of developed conceptual formulations that try to explain this, that particularly, men who are alexithymic and really have difficulty even knowing what they're feeling tend to externalize their distress. That is, they engage in that if somebody says something that might hurt their feelings or make them feel vulnerable, they get angry. And I've seen this with some men. It's almost like touching a match to magnesium. They just ignite in anger when someone hurts their feelings. And, I want to talk about this because our book is about violence, and violence is a huge problem in our society. I mean, right now we're looking at almost like an epidemic of police violence. And masculinity plays a huge role in that. There are about 45 years of studies that have shown correlations. That is that these two variables are linked between masculinity measured by one of several scales is associated with a whole host of harmful outcomes, many of which are related to violence. Now, I know of no study that has actually linked masculinity to violence because it would be unethical to create an experiment in which violence occurred. But there are many related to aggression as well as hostile attitudes towards ethnic and racial minorities, as well as hostile attitudes towards women, misogyny, rape myth acceptance, and a variety of pretty negative things. So, I think it's important to bring this up, that masculinity doesn't only harm the man, it harms people close to him, and it harms society. And I should say that, it's well known that most violent crimes, one reports that 87%, FBI report 87% of all violent crimes are committed by boys and men. But it's also true that the vast majority of boys and men are not violent. And the difference is in the masculinity. And what I mean by that is most adult men actually do not strongly endorse or conform to masculine norms. I think what happens is that masculinity is a tough standard, and many adult men say, I'm just not the most masculine guy in the world, and that's okay. I am who I am. A minority of men still feel ashamed of themselves for not meeting masculine norms, and these are men who are, I think, prone to violence. Studies have been done that show that when you threaten the masculinity of some men and then give it an opportunity to aggress in some way, and you actually have an experiment where some men have their masculinity threatened and others not, the men who have their masculinities threatened become aggressive. But there's also, if you look at a distribution of scores on a masculinity scale, as I said, most men don't endorse those norms, but there's a tail at the upper end of the men who check all the boxes, who are highly masculine. And I would say that those men are also in the group of men who are likely to commit violence. When it comes to actually predicting violence, the best that psychology can offer is that the best predictor is a history of violence, which seems to me like begging the question. And various personality traits and social situational things have been looked at. Social situational things tend to account for more variance in personality traits, and we really don't know with any accuracy of who is going to be violent. But I do want your listeners to know that masculinity plays a role in the two ways I've mentioned. Men who feel ashamed of themselves for not living up to masculinity norms, and men who are hyper masculine and check all the boxes.
I'm curious to learn more about that. I've learned, as someone who's worked with sexual violence, with survivors of sexual violence for 18 years, the prevention kind of framework that I've learned within is that hypermasculinity is a common factor in sexual violence, not across the board, but how does that fit with what you're talking about? And is there a difference in that hypermasculinity versus not being strongly endorsing those masculine traits, but feeling ashamed about it?
When you're feeling shame or guilt, that's kind of more turned inward. But when you overconform to masculinity, one of the biggest ones that I think it's the biggest one. I don't know about Ron, but I think the biggest thing about masculinity is the avoidance of all things feminine or power over women, depending on which scale you're using. And I think when people hyperconform to masculinity, you've got high levels of aggression, high levels of avoidance of femininity and dominance over women. And that just paves the way for violence.
There's also a deeper level that we get to. And we have this in the book as well. But the avoid femininity norm plays a role in the fact that boys don't play with girls in elementary school. The girls have cooties, of course, so then probably boys have cooties too. But boys have been shown through numerous studies that boys and girls play in gender segregated groups and they play differently. But what happens to boys because they do not play with girls? Most boys never get to know girls as persons, the way they get to know boys. They understand that this guy is kind of tough and this guy is very sensitive. And they understand differences among their boyfriends, but they've avoided learning about girls as persons. So when they get to middle school and puberty hits, they're suddenly starting to think about girls in a sexual way. And they've skipped this entire stage of understanding and knowing girls' personalities. So I think what that does, it creates a pathway for men's objectification of women, their sexual objectification of women, which is a huge problem. I mean, many men, regardless of how strongly they endorse norms, tend to view women as sexual objects, objectify them. And while I don't know any study linking objectification to rape, it just makes sense that if you've kind of stripped a person of their humanness and only see them as a party to a sex act, that you're more likely to take on that added step of either sexual coercion or rape. But I think that's an important point that needs to be made about kind of a really not well understood result of masculinity norms, and namely that boys don't have this history of knowing girls as persons. Most boys. Now, some do. They might have sisters or cousins, and also that might even make things worse, depending on the family. But I think you get my point that it creates a real gap in the way that boys think about girls.
I would say that that's absolutely true. Yeah. I think, the genders don't really bond in the same way. And that does pave the way for objectification of women and men feeling entitled to women.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm thinking too about how so many times groups of men, for example, how it's common for women to be raped within the context of fraternity parties, sports team parties. And I'm thinking like college, for example, but not only college. And also how men are likely to experience sexual violence as members of fraternities, sports teams, and other groups that are, gender separate. So my wheels are turning about all this.
Well, Shana, you want to say something about men who are victims of sexual violence?
Oh, yeah, I'd love to. Well, men as victims of sexual violence, we never talk about, and it is really sad. And I think the way we talk about sexual violence, we talk about it in a very scripted way. Women are the victims and men are the perpetrators. And in reality, if we're not talking about the tail end of the spectrum, so I know, Ron was talking a little bit about like the people at the high end of the MRNI, the high end of masculinity, but when we're in the middle, we're in the average where men tend to kind of be average on masculine norms. They don't tend to be really high. They're vulnerable they're vulnerable. I think it depends on when and how the sexual violence happened. A lot of it happens when they're boys. But it also can happen with significant others and girlfriends. And if you don't want to penetrate someone and someone's asking you to penetrate them, but you don't want to, but you're doing it anyways, that's coercion. It doesn't have the same script as like, oh, someone held someone down, right. But it's still wrong.
Yeah, I definitely see where young men who've had, or even teen boys who've had unwanted sexual experiences, maybe something happened during a wanted sexual experience that they didn't like, and they don't have any frame of reference of how to even understand that. It's like men don't get, in our culture, men don't get to not want to have sex. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, it's supposed to be a great job, man. And I keep seeing articles about these like female teachers that have sex with students, and the idea is just the guys think it's hilarious, and some women think it's hilarious to make these comments like "good job, buddy," and when you think like let's reverse that a little bit. Let's reverse the genders, and how would you feel then? And that's really the sexism. That's really the prejudice about it, right? This idea that I think it's sexist to think that women can't be perpetrators of violence. I don't think it's just not accurate. And to be honest, like I could go out and perpetrate violence just as much as any other man could. And I think that for things that happen to these boys and men, and they feel shame, and they really have no one to go to about it, because a lot of therapists or, the community organizations set up for rape prevention aren't quite as knowledgeable about male survivors. And so they're going to get a lot of speculation and there's probably less support.
Yeah. I mean, I would, I don't want to discourage anyone who's listening, who's male and thinking about seeking support for sexual violence. Like, I know there are many places that do have that expertise, but if you went to a place and it felt like they didn't get it, they didn't take you seriously, keep trying, because you deserve to be heard. And, but I agree. I mean, that's not our dominant narrative about sexual violence. It's like, men commit sexual violence on women is the dominant narrative. And so again, young boys, teens, and adult men who experience non-consensual sexual interactions don't even know to call it sexual assault or rape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I had a client who had that experience as a teenager, and he didn't consider it a bad thing at all. He thought he was lucky.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, it reminds me of, Chris Brown, the musician who was in a relationship with Rihanna and assaulted her. And, that was all very, very public. And a few years later, I saw that he was quoted in an article saying that I just remember he said the first time he had sex, he was a young child. I feel like it was like younger than 10 from what I recall. And he was talking about it in the article as if it was a positive thing. And, that this is like, what a man I am. But, objectively, when someone is having sex with a child under 10, they can't consent. Mm-hmm. So, it's just, what else would he think? Like, what else is the narrative? People don't want to be seen. They don't want to see themselves as victims.
No, of course not. I mean,
because that's vulnerable.
That's vulnerable. And it doesn't fit with the masculine narrative. And that's wrong. That's the case, that you can't be a survivor of sexual violence and also a man.
Right. Well, this is a fascinating conversation. I know we don't have much time left, but I just wanted to see if you have the time, if you could just go through what those norms are of masculinity that you mentioned before. You've talked about a couple of them, but I know you had a whole list.
Sure. So the ones I mentioned were avoidance of all things feminine, restrict the expression of vulnerable and caring emotions. And we've talked about those, so I don't think they need any elaboration. And then there are three that are kind of self-explanatory: self-reliance, toughness, and dominance. Then given kind of what we were just talking about, the next one is a high interest in sex. And another scale, it's called the Playboy norm, but it's, the idea that a man should always be ready for sex. And the final one is disdain for sexual minority and gender identity minority men. So those are the 7 norms of masculinity as defined by my scale, which is the Male Role Norms Inventory. There are other scales that define it a little bit differently, but generally there's a lot of coherence to this.
Thank you very much for that. And I guess the last thing I would want to ask you is if someone is listening to this and they want to understand more about masculinity and violence, I don't know how quickly you can answer this, but what do you think they will take away from your book? Is it like a compilation of research, or is it more for a general population, or what?
It's for kind of the educated non-psychologist. And it's, the kind of book that, if you want to kind of understand the psychology of masculinity without having to learn heavy duty statistics, this is your book. So we really lay out what we know and what we don't know, about the relationship, about what masculinity is and how we understand it and its relationship to physical and sexual violence, and also to the violence that men do to themselves through their poorer health habits, which is a big issue right now with men dying at a greater rate than women due to COVID-19. If listeners would like more information, we have a website for the book where they could, explore the book a little bit more. And it's called thetoughstandard.com. And, they could read a little bit about the book. There's an excerpt, there's table of contents, there are reviews of the book, and also ways to order the book.
Wonderful. And would you think that your book would be a good resource for men who want to understand more about, why they feel the way they do?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's not a mass market book. I mean, it does assume kind of a college education, but not more than that. And like I say, you don't have to be a psychologist to read it and understand the book. We wrote it for, a person who's not a psychologist. So I think, yes, I think indeed that if there's a man who really wants to understand more about kind of how masculinity impinges upon his life and also we have solutions. We talk about solutions in the final chapter, ways out of the prison that masculinity has created for a large number of men. So yes, indeed, I would recommend it to any of your listeners who are men who want to understand themselves better, to any of your listeners who are not men and want to understand men a little bit better. I think we wrote this book for you.
Wonderful. Shana, did you want to add anything there?
I think that, I think the one of the really important things, I think, is for men to be willing to seek therapy if they need it. And to know that you don't have to have a massive problem to see a therapist. I think therapy can be really helpful in uncovering a lot of things about yourself that you're struggling with. And I would also say, be open to being vulnerable with the people that you trust.
Yeah, I would amplify that last point. I mean, one message that I would give to the men who are listening to this podcast is to open up your heart to those close to you, your family, your friends. Take a risk and let them know kind of what things are bothering you. You'll be amazed at the results. You'll be amazed at kind of how this would enrich your relationships with friends and with family.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Thank you to Therapy Notes for sponsoring this week's episode. I do love Therapy Notes. It's such an asset to my business and makes my job as a practice owner and a therapist much easier. Try it today with no strings attached and see why everyone is switching to Therapy Notes, now featuring ePrescribe. Use coupon code CHAT or click the link in the show notes to get 2 free months at therapynotes.com.
Thank you for listening to Therapy Chat with your host, Laura Reagan, LCSW-C. For more information, please visit therapychatpodcast.com.